In this segment, I'm going to talk to you about two very important concepts that are linked with one another and yet have a kind of contradictory tension between them. The two concepts are civil liberties and civil rights. And they are both a part of our continuing discussion about how to create a government to stop violence while at the same time protecting ourselves from the violence that governments might do to us. They are a part of attempts to limit governments. This is especially true for civil liberties. Civil liberties are described by most scholars as being negative promises that the government makes for things they will not do to you. If you look at the wording of the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, added after the Constitution was ratified, but added in some states added because only some states ratified it with the promise that they would be added. If you look at the Bill of Rights, and I would encourage you to do so, you'll notice that most of them are negatively worded. So our amendment number 1 starts with, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," and then goes on to talk about press, speech, and assembly, and the right to petition. Article 3 says, "No soldier shall be quartered in anyone's home." Article 4, Amendment 4, has no unreasonable searches and seizures. Amendment 5 has a whole list of things, including no double jeopardy, and on and on. 8 has the promise that there shall be no cruel and unusual punishments, no excessive bail. All of them are negatively worded. And in the conception of the framers of our Constitution and the conception of the framers of the Bill of Rights that followed immediately after ratification of the Constitution, this was the most critical thing that had to be done. You had to have a clear statement, a written statement of what government could not do, and that would protect you. Now it turns out that that doesn't quite answer the question, and so roughly 100 years later, we began to look, and even more tellingly, about 150 years later, we began to look at the issue of civil rights, which are affirmative promises that government will help people, that it will protect people evenly and equally within the society. They are necessary because it turns out that if you have only a list of negative promises, that doesn't tell you that the government will act affirmatively to guarantee basic freedoms for all. That's a longer part of the story. But for right now, I'd like to focus on the clearest possible understanding between civil liberties and civil rights. And I want to emphasize that both are absolutely necessary, because if you try to have civil rights without civil liberties, you're going nowhere. How can I say that? Well, I'm going to ask you during the regular class period to review with me the provisions of the Constitution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1935. The Soviet Union's Constitution of 1935. Are you surprised to learn that a totalitarian government headed by Joseph Stalin had a constitution? Well, you might be, because of course the reality is Stalin had no limits to his powers whatsoever. But he did offer a constitution, and he offered it precisely because the idea of constitutions had been made popular by America. The idea of federalism had been popularized by America, and so he wanted to have a document that said he too was among the civilized countries in the world that had a constitution. He had no intention of it ever being followed. But if we look at the wording of his constitution, and which I will do in class, you'll notice it's an entire list of positive promises. Promises of everything. Promises of a pension in old age, promises of free health care, promises of free education, on and on and on. All nonsense, all baloney. And nothing in there has a negative promise that the government won't do something. It goes back to this logic that I talked about in an earlier segment, where these dictators want to say, we are the leaders of the people. We have majority rule. We are great democrats. Joe Stalin Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong, we are the great Democrats because we believe in democracy and we believe in majority rule. And we have all the powers of the people in our hands and there are no limits to what we can do with it. That's an extraordinarily dangerous idea. And it's embodied in Stalin's constitution, the very wording of which should tip us off to how badly worded constitutions can be. Now, having said that, I still want to underscore that while you absolutely must have civil liberties, you also must have civil rights. Why? Well, suppose you had a government that was empowered by a majority. They were able, in their own jurisdiction, to create a 51%, 49% split, and the 51% tried to dominate the minority, and they did it by withholding government protection. You might have a promise in the Constitution that was fulfilled that the government would not do something, okay? But you'd have no promise that the government would go out there and protect people. And that becomes the situation after the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed to end slavery. But that only left a question as to what was the status of those former slaves. They weren't slaves, but were they full-fledged citizens of the United States? And that was unclear. So, fairly shortly after the 13th Amendment, a 14th Amendment was proposed, meant to give equal citizenship to everyone. In the words of the 14th Amendment, all persons, or any person in the United States, any person who was born within the United States or a naturalized citizen was a citizen of the United States and of the state in which they reside. And they were promised further on, and I'm paraphrasing now, both due process of the law and equal protection of the law. Those were sections that created civil rights. They created positive promises that government must act to protect everyone. Now, those promises were not immediately fulfilled because in the wake of the Civil War, the initial winning of the Civil War put federal troops in southern states that had seceded. But as time wore on, the cost of it and the fact that it flew in the face of local opposition from defeated Confederates eventually led to the withdrawal of the federal troops and, unfortunately, the withdrawal of the promise. The affirmative promises were put in abeyance. A series of court decisions, which I will discuss in class, were passed, which ended up with the astonishing view that equal protection of the law meant equal protection of segregated citizens. That separate but equal would satisfy the requirements of the first section of the 14th Amendment. That began a long struggle to have that overturned. But between the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson and in 1896 and Brown versus Board of Education in 1952, separate but equal was the rule of the land. And only as, I think, the original understanding of the 14th Amendment was readopted in 1952, did we begin to see the creation of civil rights. Civil rights were critical because in important jurisdictions in the United States, equal protection was not provided to citizens under separate but equal. And the lack of it meant that all the civil liberties in the world were useless if you couldn't get the police to protect African American citizens from their neighbors, from private action by vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So both civil liberties and civil rights are absolutely critical to our government. Now, the way in which civil rights became adopted is also important because it touches on one of the most complicated and sophisticated understandings of the Constitution. We currently understand that the civil rights that are provided and the civil liberties that are provided are not just the province of the federal government, they are the province of state governments. That state governments and anything created by a state government, like a county or a city government, must follow the requirements of the 14th Amendment. This became possible because of the creation of a Supreme Court doctrine called selective incorporation. The language of the 14th Amendment, its language in particular that promised due process and equal protection, meant that if a particular part of the Bill of Rights was regarded as due process, as an essential part of constitutional practices in the United States, then that could be applied to the states. Why is this necessary? Well, if you look at the wording of the first 10 amendments, it starts with the words in Amendment 1, Congress shall make no law. But Congress is the federal government. It doesn't say anything about states. Only with the language of the 14th Amendment, which made equal protection and due process a requirement of the states, did we get the opening of the Bill of Rights to the states. There have always been some who thought that the 14th Amendment provided total incorporation. For example, one of the great associate justices of the Supreme Court, Hugo Black, offered the view that there was total incorporation. But the rest of the Supreme Court, and there's never been a time in which a majority of 5 members of the Supreme Court subscribed to Black's view, the rest of the Supreme Court has sought to take a step-by-step process of taking a piece of the Bill of Rights and applying it to the states through the doctrine of selective incorporation. Is all of this complicated? Yes. But the whole process of having a constitutional democratic government is itself complicated. Remember, we're trying to deal with a contradiction. Government itself is a calculated risk. We have to take that calculated risk because of the need to protect ourselves from violence, but we don't want the government to be so powerful or so coercive or so dangerous that it prevails over the top of us, that it threatens us in the way that random violence might. Therefore, it is critical that we begin the sophisticated and critical process of trying to balance what are essentially contradictory principles. The distinction between civil liberties and civil rights, the importance of the 14th Amendment, the importance of the doctrine of selective incorporation are all a part of that effort that we are making.